Hi guys, welcome back to our Alternate Future North America series. And while lots happening with a few nations becoming very anti-communism, but we'll get to those nations later. Some are nationalists, some are fascists, and some are not. But quickly, California and the Confederate States string an alliance for an attack on Mexico, with them both wanting to attack them, knowing they would want to attack them too, to get an ally to speed up this process. And well, Mexico quickly gets pushed back, and many lands are captured within the first week. And while they move down the coast pretty fast, and a landing in Yucatan by the Confederate States works out well. And well, Mexico launches a counteroffensive, but it goes really badly. Land gain, but a lot of casualties. An extreme amount. Well, before they're even done their counteroffensive, they got pushed right back down the coast. You may be wondering why this is important. Well, at this point, a rebellion breaks out, with fascist forces being angry for Mexico's weakness. Well, they break out across the south, and they quickly capture Mexico City, and parts of the southern part of it, and them being funded by these nations. And well, the fall of Mexico begins after this, as they manage to flee into other territories, into Honduras Guatemala, probably Honduras, or maybe El Salvador. And well, they quickly gain lands. And while in the north, a few rebellions break out, with them gaining a big chunk of this territory, and in the south, with them meeting for a peace treaty at this point. And well, let's see the peace treaty Florida in a previous conflict being annexed back, along with even more, with California annexing more coastal territory and a bit in the desert, with Florida re-annexing their holding in, well, the CSA re-annexing the holding Florida had in Yucatan, as well as a bit more crossing the country, with the fascist government now having to deal with these two places. And at this point, a new alliance forms. They call themselves the Anti-Communist League, the Anti-Communist Coalition. And well, they also get Quebec and the Western Union, Quebec and the CSA being the two fascist nations / nationalists. And then we see California and, well, the Western Union. The Western Union wants revenge, and they want that. And well, before it can even start, Montana ends up annexed by the Communist League. After this, war is declared upon the Communist League, and they launch an offensive across the place. And well, their enemies were not really expecting it, but kind of were, but not this soon. And well, an invasion begins. And well, the invasion of New York begins from two fronts. And while an invasion of Colorado goes really well, Colorado People's Republic. And well, they quickly start to occupy land. And well, yeah, and against the Western Union. It doesn't go well with the Western Union's invasion. But California does pretty well, taking Vancouver. But now a counteroffensive begins, and British Columbia fully takes advantage of it. And they even liberate parts of Colorado, because Colorado is too weak. And New York has a good time pushing Quebec fully out, and then pushing the Confederate States out, and then they launch an offensive But at the same time, the Western Union ends up attacked. And well, they manage to occupy all of this land. And then they start to push into more, but they fail to take all areas. And then an invasion of the CSA begins. But at this point, a counteroffensive is launched, completely kicking them out. And well, the fall of New York begins, but during this, it collapses. Colorado collapses, and New York, before it falls, decided its best idea was to invade Kentucky and, well, Ohio. But they end up failing, and this leads to the fall of them. And, well, they push them all the way back. And New York begins to head towards fall. And it finally does. After New York City fell, which isn't the capital, though, but enough to make them fall. And at this point, the liberation of the Western Union begins, with them moving in, managing to push them away from Winnipeg, which is the only city they had left. And then they push them back to the border. And with the fall of British Columbia beginning, with Vancouver Island as well as Vancouver area falling, and an invasion from the other front, and they eventually take over the southern part of it, and they move up the coast, and British Columbia eventually ends up surrendering. So now for the peace treaty, including Florida annexing most of Kansas and a bit of Nebraska. Well, most of Colorado ended up part of California. Same with, like, Montana. And then the southern part of British Columbia, with the rest of it ending up part of the Western Union, which also managed to get a bit of lands into Nebraska and Montana. And then the Confederate States, well, they annex southern parts of New York, and they annex Kentucky, but they also, Ohio gains a bit of land. Well, that's pretty much all for today's video. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Wild Mapper out, but not until you subscribe. Why she subscribes? We get to 3,500 subscribers by September 30th. So please subscribe.